I mean, story creates culture within organizations. Story can create relationships with vendors, etc. You know, it's certainly said, I don't know how true it is, but it's certainly said that with Gen Z and millennials, your company needs to be more than just a place to make money. You need to have a story about the meaning and what you're doing in the world, etc. So I think story has become more important overall.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to The Leverage Leader. I have an amazing guest with me today. His name is Stever Robinson. Not Steven Robinson, Stever Robinson. Okay, Stever Robbins. And he's an executive coach for high-performing entrepreneurs and corporate leaders. He has co-founded two companies. He's an additional team member of several others, and co-led the design team for Harvard Business School's Foundations program. His Get It Done Guide podcast, he spent 12 years doing that, and he was at iTunes Top 10 for 12 years, guys. 12 years was pretty awesome. He is a master trainer elite of NLP and a graduate of MIT and Harvard Business School. I know you're thinking like, oh man, this guy, man, he's way too far to accomplish. But let me tell you something. This guy's a pretty amazing guy, and you're about to enjoy an amazing interview, amazing conversation. So sit back, grab your notepad and pen. This is going to be another six-figure lesson for you in a matter of a half an hour. Stever, welcome. Welcome to the podcast, man.
Thank you for having me. You know, I love that introduction. I was listening to it thinking, boy, I wish that I could be like that guy. I'm kind of like, oh, we always sound so much different. At least I find, right, in your bio, which just distills certain points of your personality and kind of puts them in close proximity. And yeah, and there's actually a whole lesson there about PR and about public image and all that other stuff. But I'm not sure that's our topic for today.
Well, listen, the beauty about you, Stever, is that you have layers. And so, you know, I can already tell, like, I will have you as a guest again on a different subject matter. But I will tell you, man, the resume, the bio is impressive. Number one, because I always wanted to get my graduate degree from Harvard, and I didn't go. So it's cool to be able to know somebody who does. Actually, like, you're like the second or third person that I have as a colleague now that has went to Harvard. And so what I want to talk to you about today, what we're discussing today, is the whole concept.
I even got the bag.
So the piece that the dynamic, which I thought was so amazing, because having had such success as you've had as a podcast, I mean, wow, come on, man, 12 years in the top 10 of iTunes and podcasts, a master trainer elite of NLP, and of course a graduate of MIT and Harvard. Like, that's a huge piece there. The one thing that I grabbed from all that, there's one word that comes up for me in all of it, and that is opportunity. Opportunity, and the ability to capitalize on opportunity. And that's kind of like what I want to talk with you about today. That's the subject for this show, is just about how to leverage opportunity. But I wanted to take a moment and see that like, you know, establish a framework, a foundation, if you will, of opportunity. How do you define opportunity?
Wow, you didn't warn me you were going to ask that. That's a very good question. And it's funny because as you were saying that, there's one particular story that you need to ask me about, which was the moment that I got accepted to Harvard Business School.
Hey, we can start there and let you answer that question on the back end, because I think it may set the context for the answer.
So you didn't read this in my bio because I didn't tell you this in my bio, but I grew up in a polyamorous traveling New Age commune starting psychic growth centers as we traveled across the country. As you can imagine, I was not the most popular kid in school. In fact, I was the kid that all of the parents warned their kids to stay away from because we were a pretty weird family. And I never thought of anything like Harvard Business School or MIT. And one day I was at my job and it was my yearly review, and my manager said, "What do you want to do next?" And I said, "Well, I was working for a company that had, I thought, the best product on the market, and they were going out of business. We had just had a round of layoffs, and I said, I want to understand, how is it possible to have the best product on the market and be going out of business? That makes no sense to me." And she said, to understand that, you need to understand strategy or marketing. And I said, okay, I don't even know what those words mean, because my undergrad was in engineering and I had zero experience in business. And she said, oh, well, to understand marketing and strategy, you need either gray hair or an MBA. The gray hair still hasn't happened. The MBA, however, I said, no way do I ever want to go back to school. And she said, oh, just go sit in on a class and then you can always decide not to go or not to apply. So I just happened to live walking distance to Harvard Business School. So I walked down the street to Harvard Business School, said, could I sit in on a class, watch the class, thought, wow, that looks like so much fun. And I went home and I applied, and I went to my boss and I said, well, you're right. It looked like a lot of fun. So I applied. And she said, and if you get in, you don't have to go. And so fast forward several months, I am standing in my living room when I get this letter from Harvard Business School, and I open the letter and it's my acceptance letter. And I'm looking at that letter and I am thinking, I grew up in a traveling New Age commune with hippies.
Wow.
And I'm holding an acceptance letter from Harvard Business School. And I called my boss and I said, Nancy, you are wrong. I can't say no to this. This is too big an opportunity. Now, think about in that moment what opportunity meant, right? I was standing in my living room looking at a piece of paper. The concept of opportunity was nothing more than my imagined story about what the consequences would be of me saying yes and going to this school. So one thing I want to be is very clear, that opportunity, in terms of your ability to recognize it, is the story that you're telling yourself about whatever events happen to be happening. So let's say that you decide to start a podcast. You could tell yourself the story, hey, this podcast is going to be in the iTunes top 10, and it's going to be this gigantic professional launching thing. And I'm going to be, driving around in Maseratis and people will be throwing gold at me. And, that image may be right or might be wrong. It's wrong, by the way. No one threw gold at me. I wanted them to, but they were like, no, we want to keep our own gold. But the opportunity is the story you tell. So if it's your story you tell about future results. So in some sense, what opportunity is, or what the ability to recognize opportunity is, it's the ability to tell yourself a story that actually is plausible and that is related to like to an actual possible course of action, right? I mean, I'm watching this TV series called The Americans right now, and one of the characters on it is in a Russian prison. And if you're in a Russian prison, you can tell yourself all the stories you want to about how tomorrow you're going to be, crowned king of the world and given your freedom. And it's not necessarily clear that that story is connected to the reality of your situation. On the other hand, you can be a New Age hippie kid standing in your living room reading an acceptance letter from Harvard Business School, and you can create a story saying, oh, this will open certain opportunities for me. And that's plausible. So in my case, I would say I was recognizing a genuine opportunity. Now, I'm like kind of about to go down a whole rabbit hole here. I want to make sure that I'm keeping the pacing that you want.
So here's the piece that's extremely significant. You said like an entire treasure chest of gold with one sentence, and that is, opportunity is the story you tell yourself. And I had to write that down because here's the piece. Opportunity comes packaged so many different ways for different people. Okay, here you were, coming from a hippie family, standing in the living room, getting this letter, and you saw this as an opportunity. The acceptance was the opportunity. Okay. When she presented the opportunity for you to go to class, that was an opportunity. When you saw another opportunity, you discerned another opportunity. For me, in my case, the doctor came in and said, Mr. Williams, you could be dead in 10 days. So he gave me a 10-day death sentence. Rather than me focusing on that particular challenge, what I did was said, okay, impact or excuse, you decide. And you can either take these 10 days and focus on, all of the things that didn't happen in your life or happened in your life, or you can play full out. You can play full out and make an impact in the lives of others. Taking that train of thought, I ended up looking up 30 days later and I'm 20 days past the expiration date. So opportunity comes packaged in different ways. But I think the most powerful thing about opportunity, the most profound thing I have ever heard anybody say about opportunity was what you just mentioned. And that is, it's the story you tell yourself. It's the story you tell yourself. And then as we look at it, and then we go on, we can kind of fast forward a little bit into the Get It Done Guy podcast that you had and the success that you had from that. How did that, I mean, it's almost like a mindset. Like, did you see it that way? Or were you just looking at it like, here's this
No.
piece? Like, what was your processing around that?
Okay. Well, I want to say one more thing about opportunity, which you can then call back to later, which is that because part of the piece about telling yourself a story, right? I said you have to tell yourself a plausible, for it to be a real opportunity, your story has to be plausible. And you mentioned that there's a wide range of possible outcomes, right? And that could happen. And the piece that is really important to understand is the more you develop yourself and your skills and certain kinds of skills, not all skills, certain kinds of skills, the more plausible stories you have in any given moment to recognize opportunity.
Oh, that's
so
huge.
Yeah, I mean, think about it, right? If you know accounting and you know marketing, then when someone says, hey, I'm going to create a company creating wristbands out of paracord so that people can practice knots. I'm making that up because I happen to be holding a piece of paracord that I use for practicing knots. If you have both of those skill sets, you can come up with a whole set of stories like, oh, this might be an opportunity for me to get involved in marketing this. And let me think about all the different ways that I could market paracord or market classes and how to tie knots. But since you also have the finance background or the accounting background, you could think, oh, gee, I could sit down and calculate the gross margins on how knots work and how I could sell knots, and I could build a business that allows it to scale exponentially. So the more skills you have, the more different stories you can tell. Thus, the more ways you can take any one thing that happens and turn it into an opportunity.
This is huge. This is huge. I just want to interject this. The more you develop yourself, the more plausible story you can tell yourself. That's everything. That's everything because, again, as you were saying it, the thing that was coming up for me was, okay, the more you develop yourself, the more skills you develop, the better mindset you develop, those things, that story becomes more plausible by the minute. If you want a master's degree, but you don't have a bachelor's degree, probably a good idea to get a bachelor's degree first. So
but I know people who have gotten the master's first. I do know people who've done that. But
it's just a piece that as you do it, wow, this is so significant because the achievement of one thing made the idea or story of doing another thing that much more plausible to do.
Correct.
And so people really it's like the momentum of it all and the expansion or the greater the realization of that opportunity. So I just wanted to interject that, but by all means, my guy, please keep going.
I was about to say, I've never also expressed my ideas about opportunity this way before. It's only because of the question you asked. So I really want to make sure I get a copy of this because I'm sitting here going like, this is really good. Okay, right? Opportunity, because I can see different ways I can use that. So the Get It Done guy, I want to say I foresaw the rise of podcasting. And it was exactly the opposite. Podcasting was declining when I started the podcast in 2007. It had had a brief blip after it was introduced, and it was kind of doing okay, but it was not a big thing. And I had started a little podcast on my own, just for the heck of it, because I have a lot to say and it's hard to shut me up. And I figured if I can put it on audio, then boom, other people can hear what I have to say. And I started a podcast called Business Explained, which the feed is still out there. It was dormant for the years that I did the Get It Done guy, but I've started adding things to it again as I do interviews with people. So check out Business Explained by Steve Robbins on iTunes. But I had done about 6 or 7 episodes of that. And no, it was okay. I was kind of having fun. And then I heard Grammar Girl. And Grammar Girl had a podcast on grammar. She still does. And she had characters. She had an aardvark, and she had a snail named Squiggly, and they would discuss grammar and things. And I listened and I was like, wow, she has made grammar, not an inherently interesting subject to most people, really fun to listen to. And I thought, darn it, I want to do something that's fun to listen to. I'm tired of all this stupid business stuff. And so I wrote Grammar Girl a fan letter. And I said, dear Grammar Girl, if you ever decide you want to add a business podcaster to your network, I would love to do a business podcast with you. And my letter just happened to arrive. She had a network that had 5 podcasters, and she had just sold that network to Macmillan Publishing, like the week before I sent her this letter. And she was just heading into the meeting where they were going to decide who their first new podcaster was going to be when my letter hit her desk. So, complete coincidence in terms of timing and intersection of things. And she wrote me back and she said, what topic do you want to do? And I said, well, I'll do whatever topic people want the most. I want to do this because it'll be fun. I need a creative outlet. I want to talk about aardvarks and snails, although instead I ended up talking about megalomaniacal dictators and man-eating plants. But we're allowed a little bit of artistic license. And I said, so I don't care what the topic is, as long as it's a topic that I have expertise in. And she said, no. She said, we don't want you to fit yourself to the market. We want to know what excites you so that you'll really be motivated to do it. And I thought about a bunch of different topics. And what I did in my business at that point, right, was, and still is, strategic advice in helping to develop leaders and turn high potential leaders into high realization leaders. And I thought about it, and I was like, okay, that's interesting, but I don't know how interesting I could make that in a podcast. And then I realized, but I'm kind of a geek, right? I mean, I may have been raised as a new age hippie, but I like pens. I have 20 different pens, each one for a very specific purpose. And I have, dot note-taking paper. I'm like ridiculously organized in that way, largely because I'm by nature disorganized. So I've had to invent all of these systems so that I can track all the projects that I'm doing and stay organized with everything. And I said, screw business. I'm not going to use this podcast for business. This is just going to be my creative outlet. It's just going to be fun. And I'm going to do it on personal productivity, which has nothing to do with the kind of coaching I do. I do high level business. I'm kind of a one-man MBA program. So I turn people into competent general managers. And I said, I'm just gonna go out on a limb and do this random productivity thing. So I did. That was how I chose it. And at the time, the only opportunity that I was looking at it for was just as a creative outlet. So the stories that I was telling myself was, what? I'm going to be able to be funny and goofy and use my sense of humor and give people all of these fun little tips about how to organize their task list and their work and, how to deal with difficult people and stuff. And it's going to have no impact on the rest of my life. Well, so we launched in Thanksgiving of 2007. And just because I decided that I was going to hire a PR firm and try to get into the iTunes top 100 sometime in the following year, sometime in 2008. So I had a PR firm all lined up to go, and we were going to start the PR campaign on January 1st, 2008. And I hit number 3 on iTunes on December 27th, 2007. So didn't need the PR campaign. Not only did I make it into the top 100, I made it into the top 10. And I stayed in the top 10 business category for a really long time. I mean, for long enough that I eventually stopped paying close attention just because, I was always in it. And I stayed number one actually for several weeks. Um, and then kept getting back to number one, for a few years after that. Um, and once you hit number one in a category like that, especially a major category like business, then you suddenly have a lot more plausible stories to tell yourself, because suddenly now you have a credential. Now, I had a couple credentials before, but this is a kind of a media credential. Now, once you have a platform and a media credential, certain stories become more plausible. Like, I can call Coach and ask him to be on my podcast and he'll say yes, even though if I were a minor peon in the world, I couldn't even get through his assistant. But if I call and I say, hey, this is a top 10 podcaster who'd like to talk to you, that actually gets through a lot of gatekeepers very quickly. Mm-hmm. So I began to be able to tell and search for plausible stories that said, given what I have accomplished so far, what could come next? So another thing, for example, was a book. I had always wanted to publish a book. I had written several book proposals in the past and submitted them to publishers and just not gotten any interest, couldn't get an agent interested. I thought my book ideas were brilliant, of course. One of them was a handbook for first-time managers, because as I think I intimated, I like working with really high potential people and helping them accelerate their skills and their ability to produce results as fast as possible. And what I found was there's no training provided for this in the world. Like, it's bizarre. We don't actually train anyone once they hit the management level, except maybe a 2-day seminar on how to give feedback here or there. But we do very little to develop their skills. So I was like, this will be a great book. Couldn't get any interest. Once I had the top 10 podcast, suddenly now the story changes. Now the story is top podcaster wants to publish a book. Now, I didn't even have to write a proposal. What happened was Macmillan, who owned the podcast feed, they actually approached me and they said, the podcast is so successful, we would like you to write a book. And now I'm thinking, okay, now I have top 10 podcast and published author with mainstream publisher. So each one of these pieces increased both the size of the stories I could tell about the future and also the number of different paths. I could have elected at that point, you know what, why don't I just become an author? And every year I'll write a book, and eventually one of them will become an international bestseller. That was not the course that I chose, but that's one plausible direction. Another plausible direction is, let me use the Get It Done guide to meet wonderful people like Coach, and I'll get a bunch of us together and we will form some sort of startup involving podcasting, or we'll form some type of union and conference of people who have interesting things in some topic that we all agree. I mean, who knows? I'm reaching here because I'm trying to improvise this in the moment, but the point is, the more you have, the broader and deeper you can tell plausible stories that have a chance of
this is huge, because again, we're talking about leveraging opportunity. And when you said opportunity, the way you defined it is brilliant. And it is absolutely brilliant, and it's done in a way that provides profound insight, but a practitioner approach to it. Like, listen, the more you do these things, you make the decision to grow yourself, the more plausible story you can tell yourself. So, like, in essence, you're leveraging growth to create greater opportunities, but you're leveraging opportunities, to be able to expand and create some authority in your platform, because look at what took place as a result of that. And so, man, let's take this as a foundation, because I'm pretty sure you, like me, we could go down this path for another 2 hours without taking a breath. Without taking a breath, we could do it. But I want to bring this in because, like, I know people are eavesdropping. That's, with our audiences are the eavesdroppers on the whole situation. So with that being the case, you are an executive coach. You work with high performers. Breakthrough performance, that's my thing. I absolutely love to hear people talk about it. And I firmly believe that leverage is the key to breakthrough performance, personally. And to that, what would you say?
I would say yes. And remember how before I said that you broaden the number and the depth of your options and the story and the plausible. I want to make sure I want to keep inserting the word plausible because that part's really
Plausible.
important. I mean, there
Yes.
are some people who say, "Oh, if I invest in the lottery every week, I'll eventually make millions." And I'm like, that's not a plausible story. It's a story, but it's not a plausible
It's
one.
not a plausible one.
So there are different kinds of skills that enable different kinds of stories. And if you're
Ooh.
talking about leverage, the kinds of skills that enable leverage are skills that are transferable across a wide number of different areas. So if you learn to be a woodworker, that is going to open up all of these plausible stories about ways you could do woodworking. However, if something happens and somebody says, "Hey, I have this loop of paracord and I want to have paracord to teach people how to do knots," that set of skills doesn't give you any plausible stories to say why you should be part of the paracord story. However, there are skills, and I mentioned like the ability to do simple accounting, understanding marketing and how to talk to customers, forming relationships, structuring deals, doing sales. These are all skill sets that can be inserted into a very, very wide range. Writing, good communication skills, public speaking. These are skills that can be combined with almost any set of circumstances, and you can find some number of plausible stories as to how you can get involved. And I call these meta skills. I don't know why I call them meta skills, but they're transferable skills as opposed to really specific skills. Generally speaking, if you're working your way up for the bottom, you need both. You need specific skills because that's what people hire you for when you're at the bottom of an organization. But as you go forward in your career, more and more, it becomes about these transferable skills. So it becomes more about the people skills. It becomes more about the negotiating skills. It becomes more about the ability to do persuasive presentations. And those skills are transferable, and they really broadly open up they broadly open up the opportunity stories, even independently of things like the degrees that you have, right? So two other things. One is, yes, if you can get a Harvard MBA, it's probably a reasonable idea. Talk to me first, because it's not always a good idea. It increases the number of stories a lot. Having a good variety of people in your personal network, that opens up tons of stories, because then when someone says to you, you're at a party and they say, "We're forming this startup to give people paracord to teach them knots," and you're like, bizarrely, I have a friend who's like the #1 wilderness instructor for Outward Bound, and he was telling me about how you can use knots to do accounting in ancient civilizations, and you can use them to like repair your boat, and I'm like, great, well, why don't I call him and put him in touch with this? And now we have 3 people involved in the venture, and who knows what that person is bringing. I have not consciously tried to create a varied network. It's just kind of happened by chance, because when you go to a technical school and a business school and you were raised in a New Age commune, you end up with a very eclectic and bizarre, a varied network anyway. But I was talking to someone once, and they said, "Steve, you just know everyone." I'm like, "No, I don't. I feel like I hardly know anyone." And they said, "No. Anytime we say we need something, you always know one person who is involved in that thing." I was like, nonsense. And he looked at me and said, "Giraffe trainer." And I was like, "See, I actually." And I knew someone who worked at a zoo who had been a giraffe trainer. I was like, okay, point taken. I get it. But the more people I know, the more plausible stories that I have, because now I can involve all of these people who have skills and contexts that I know nothing about. But since I'm the one who's connecting everyone, I suddenly now become part of this. Become part of whatever gets created. 95% of the time, the fact that I have a wide network doesn't really make a big difference. 5% of the time, I put people together and something happens. And that's when that's when things take a turn that other people would call opportunity, and I would say, well, yeah, it was opportunity, but was the opportunity that particular set of circumstances, or was the opportunity the fact that I had spent 20 years getting a wonderful Rolodex of people that I like, who I like them, and they think highly of me. And then when that circumstance came about, I was able to pull from these different places to bring people together to make something happen. I would claim the actual thing that created the opportunity was the years I spent networking. And it just so happened that that enabled me to come up with a plausible story when this set of external circumstances happened that I could put everything together.
You know, I'm your conversation causes me to think, what was the importance of story 20, 30 years ago in business? Like how many people were telling their story to
are you referring
create,
to, well, I mean, certainly for things like blogging and podcasts, et cetera, there was much less of it. And I think there was also a lot less awareness that story was powerful in the context of organizations themselves.
exactly.
I mean,
That's where I was going.
yeah. I mean, story creates culture within organizations. Story can create relationships with vendors, et cetera. It's certainly said, I don't know how true it is, but it's certainly said that with Gen Z and millennials, your company needs to be more than just a place to make money. You need to have a story about the meaning and what you're doing in the world, et cetera. So I think story has become more important overall. And I guess I'm not really talking about external stories here when I talk about opportunity. I'm talking about the internal stories.
The
Right?
internal stories. Yes, yeah. That's exactly where I'm going. Like the internal story. And that brings us to, as an executive coach of high performers, when you're looking at, say you have a client, they have an organization that, they're trying to get it up off the ground, or maybe they're in an organization and they're trying to build a different team. They're trying to make a pivot due to, the external circumstances going on around them. Like, how many times do you come across the situations like this where people say, and I have all these, like, I do have this, I do have the degree, I do have this many years in business, but I can't translate that into opportunity. I'm not able to take, like I have all these wonderful things about me, but I'm not being able to translate that into an opportunity, to take this thing to the next level. Yes, I got to this point in business. Yes, I've gotten to this place, but somehow or another, I feel limited right now and not able to go forward. Like how often do you come across that as an executive coach?
Oh, a lot. I mean, it isn't even about being an executive coach. I come across that in daily life. And one of the things that's interesting, now you'll have to excuse me because I have never framed opportunity as story before. That literally was your question prompted that. And the more I'm thinking about this, the more I'm going like, wow, that's a powerful framing. One of the things that I have found is that a lot of people, especially if you're a high performer and you have a lot of success, you develop theories about why you're successful. And that becomes the stories that you use to base your future success on. Now, remember, I'm not talking about the reality, I'm talking about the story you tell yourself. So let me give you a really interesting example. If my podcast has hit #1 on iTunes 3 weeks later, the story that I would have told myself was that if you pay a PR company $50,000, you'll get to be #1 on iTunes. Now, because I hit number 3, whatever, but because I hit the iTunes leaderboard before the PR firm was scheduled to start, that's not the story I end up telling. The story that I end up telling to myself, is, wow, there were unknown factors at work. So now in the future, when I'm looking for opportunity, I don't think, oh, I need to get a PR firm. What I think is, a PR firm is one of the many options, but there also may be unknown factors involved that are working either in my favor or against me. So in some sense, it gives me a different way of thinking about future opportunity. What I have found, and I actually have a very specific person in mind, I have somebody who's been extremely successful, and they run their own business, and they have just had really bad success the last couple of years. Not success, they've had really bad business performance. And we were talking, and it became very clear that there was only one story that they had about how to turn their circumstances into opportunity. And I obviously can't reveal specifics. I'll make up a parallel example. Let's say that this person's business was a dry cleaning business, and the way that they had always gotten customers was by going around their neighborhood and just putting leaflets under people's doors. And the last couple of years, they continued to do that and it stopped working. And so in our conversation, I said, well, have you tried other things? Have you tried listing on Yelp? Have you tried going around to see if there are other dry cleaners that have opened up near you? Because you didn't mention anything about the competition. Maybe the problem isn't the way you're communicating. Maybe the problem is that there are competitors that you haven't noticed. And if you can find out how they're taking your business, right? Are they offering different services? Are they offering cheaper prices? You can respond against that. And I came up with 5 or 6 different courses of action and different ways of thinking about this. And the only story the person had been telling themselves was, I'm not giving out enough leaflets. So they went out and gave out more leaflets, more leaflets, more leaflets, and it didn't work. And I said, whoa, I said, if it's not working, that's not the right story. I said, you need a lot more ways of thinking about this situation, because the one way that you had isn't working. It may have worked for you for the last 10 years, but it's not working now.
Man, this is powerful. I didn't mean to cut you off. I was just saying the power in this, because now what you're speaking to subliminally is when the leverage of opportunity works against you.
Yep, same. Yeah, very much the same thing. One of the things I've just never understood, the block that I live on, when I moved in here, there was a corner restaurant and they were only open for breakfast. They were a breakfast only restaurant. And they were declining. They had been in this neighborhood for 30 years or very, very long time. And they were doing less and less business. And you could tell because you could walk by there, and over the first few years I lived here, there were fewer and fewer people in it as time went by. And eventually they closed. And what I never understood was, why didn't they think about doing lunch? Or why didn't they change what they served for breakfast? Because they certainly never asked. I mean, their story was, if we keep doing this thing that we're doing, we will get more business. And I'm kind of like, look, if I'd been running that business, I would have said, what are all the possible stories that I can think of about what the situation is? And then, which ones of those are plausible and how can I check them out? But I would have done something like, you know what? Let's spend a couple days literally just walking around the neighborhood, knocking on people's doors and saying, hey, did you know if we have this awesome breakfast restaurant over there? I've never seen you in there. Why don't you come in? And if people say, well, I don't want breakfast at a restaurant, but boy, could I use lunch, which, by the way, there were no lunch places around. They probably would have made a fortune if they had done that. But it never occurred to them to do that, because they had, the story they had was, we're giving people the product they want at the price they want. And if they're not coming in, it has, so we're going to continue giving them what we're currently giving them at the current prices. And I'm like, the story's not serving you anymore. It may have been a description of truth once upon a time, but it isn't at this point. And there are tons of other stories. There's stories about competition. And I keep calling these stories. Some people would say what I'm talking about now are, genuine business trends and demographic trends and things like that.
No, but it's true though. It's true that these are truly indeed stories, because, from what I grasp and what I gather from what you're saying, or extract from what you're saying, is that when you are able to tell yourself a plausible story, or when you're able to see, how this thing could work favorably for you, it becomes, very beneficial. It becomes an advantage. It truly, it puts you an advantage. When you see it, when you're stuck in something and you keep telling yourself the same story over and over again, what's interesting about that is that while it does become the obstacle versus the opportunity, because they're stuck in that way of thinking, they're making it plausible. See, I told you I couldn't do this. See, I told you I couldn't make it. So I'm looking at it and I'm seeing both spectrums of, like, each side of the, the whole polarity of it all. It's like if you're telling yourself a story, you telling yourself a story is one thing, but then what are you doing to make it plausible? Are you growing, or are you staying stuck in it? Are you holding on to the story that you told yourself the last 20 years? And if that's the story you keep telling yourself, then that is an obstacle. you're creating an obstacle. If you're telling yourself something different and you're growing or whatever else, you're making the idea of success more plausible and creating greater opportunity for it. So I want to share that because I think the audience would benefit greatly from your expertise in understanding how opportunity can work for you. And then when it works against you, it ultimately becomes the obstacle that keeps you from achieving what it is that you want.
Oh, sure. Well, one of the things, and I do want to stress, opportunity is the story. It doesn't mean you'll be able to successfully realize that opportunity. What it does mean, though, is that that your story and your ability to have plausible stories and lots of them that you can pursue means that you'll have more options in a given
Exactly.
situation, right? But think about Barack Obama. I would suggest that when he decided to run for president, the prevailing story was a black man couldn't be president in America. And by the way, that probably was a pretty plausible story. That's I would not have suggested that every black male adult, or black woman adult for that
And
matter,
there were
run for
several
president.
that tried on both sides. Like it wasn't
Yeah.
that they were all they were black and Democrat. I mean, Colin Powell, he
Yep.
ran and he was receiving death threats from that. So
Yeah.
it's not due to the party. It was just what you said. For a long
Right.
time, the plausible story was that it just was not going to happen.
So he had a different story. Now, again, Colin Powell had a different story, etc. Like there are plenty of people who had a different story, and that story didn't work out. So they had the opportunity story, and it just didn't. And they weren't able to do it either for reasons within them or for just societal reasons or whatever. And I should be very clear: I am not one of those people who believes that anyone can do anything. I believe there is an external world out there, and that external world puts constraints on you, and they are not fair constraints, and they are not always under one's control. I'm actually listening to Trevor Noah's autobiography right now. I was born a crime, right? And I mean, he talks about growing up in apartheid in South Africa, and there were very real physical limits on what he could do in his existence, right? If he walked out in the daytime unaccompanied by an adult, given where he was living, he literally could be picked up and stuck in jail for the rest of his life. Like, that is an actual reality. So you can't ignore reality in all of this. However, he could also construct a story of, I can find a way out of this. And that, in fact, interestingly, right, the autobiography in some sense is that story. It's, these were the things I was thinking. These were the things other people were thinking. Didn't occur to me to think those. I thought these other things instead. And, so opportunity is the stories you tell. And then there's reality. and there's reality and circumstance and networks and all of that stuff. And then, there is, you do what you can do to try to make those opportunities real using the networks and the stories that you have and using the constraints that you're under. Sometimes you do it, sometimes you don't. Sometimes you do it and it's your fault that you did it, right? You hired a PR firm and you got yourself into the top 100. Sometimes it's not your fault. You hired the PR firm, but you made it into the top 100 before you did anything, took any efforts. So that's another thing that I think we interestingly do both a service and a disservice to people, in modern culture, is we tell each other that, oh, it's under your control. It's under your control. It's not under your control, but it's also not under your control. Some things are under your control. Some things aren't. If you're going whitewater rafting, or whatever it is that you do, canoeing, with the paddle, it is absolutely under your control that you can paddle harder, or you can paddle just on one side. You can definitely affect the course of the canoe, but you're in a river and the river is going, and you can affect the course of the canoe, but only in one broad direction, because the river is not going to let you go in the other direction. And I think it's important to understand that about life, that you can paddle and paddle and paddle, and if the current pushes you into the weeds at the side of the thing, it doesn't mean you're a failure. It means, you were paddling pretty hard, the current pushed you into the side of the thing. And I am perfectly happy to talk. I have spent more of my life stuck in the weeds on the side of the river than I have going full steam ahead. I mean, that's not the things people want me on the podcast to talk about. They always want to talk about the successes and the things that lead to success. But there have been things, some of which under my control, some of which not, where stuff that I just knew it was a sure thing, totally bombed. And then other things.
The takeaway, though, the powerful takeaway, and we can come back and talk more about this at another time, but that the powerful takeaway in it, because this is the leverage leader, right? It's getting in the water and navigating, going back and paddling, right? You have that there is an opportunity within that, understanding what you just said. The river's only going to let you go one way. So let's make this relevant. Like for me, we're having a condition of incomplete paraplegia. You have to understand that, with you being, they have an extreme weakness in the legs, you have to understand the reality of it. Okay, I have extreme weakness in the legs. So me taking off and running 100 miles an hour, me jumping 47 inches there, that's not, but when I do understand, okay, what can I do? How do I push the limits on this opportunity? How can I operate and be as successful as I can be inside this? Here's another thing that most people don't want to accept. As an individual, you have limits. You have limitations. You yourself are a limitation. The fact that you are in a human body, you are limited. You cannot be everywhere at one time. Marketing can put you in a lot of different, but you can only be at one place physically at one time. That is the limitation. That's why you have to have certain things incorporated in your life so that you don't overextend yourself all in one area. However, how you work inside of that limitation of being one person in one body can impact how you achieve significantly. People have found a way to create a sense of omnipresence, being open 24 hours a day. If you just told someone 20 years ago that people had 24-day business hours, they'd be like, there's no way in the world that was possible. But they found the leverage through, online presence and all of that to create this perception that, we are open. We do business 24 hours and things of that nature. And that's what I'm saying here. When you're talking about the dynamic of high performing, these people that you're coaching and working with, they get the whole concept of acceleration. But even at that level, how they operate inside of the opportunity really makes the story more plausible, for the success of it. Or if they're telling themselves, what, man, this is my limit and I can't do this stuff, you're making that more plausible, that story more plausible, and you're going to guarantee failure of it.
Yeah. And keep in mind what technology does is technology increases the number of stories that we can tell and that we can conceive of. It's funny, I was reading a thing, man, I forgot, it was on the emergence of some technology, and it said, people say that so-and-so invented this technology. And they're like, except for the fact that they had to steal every other part of the thing that went into that. Like when we say, Elon Musk, invented the electric car. No, he didn't. Right? I mean, there were tens of millions of people who figured out how to do things like smelt ore and create girders and then create sheet metal. There are people who had to figure out how battery chemistry worked, all of this stuff. None of that, he didn't do any of that. Now, once that had been done, he was able to look at that, and instead of thinking in 1970s terms, he was able to say, oh, now that all of this exists, I can plausibly think of a way to put them together to make an electric car that will actually work and be cost effective, although I don't know if it's cost effective or not. But because electric cars have come out before. In fact, there's a movie, a documentary called Who Killed the Electric Car? About electric cars that were brought to market like 30, 40 years ago, like way before Elon Musk had thought about electric cars. So the story had been told before, but Elon was able to tell a slightly different story for a number of reasons, but a lot of which were technological. But that's what technology allows us to do, right? You are here talking to me because of a combination of medical technology and also Zoom, which didn't exist 15 years ago, et cetera. So, keep an eye out for what's changing about the world, because the things that change about the world are going to enable new stories. And a bunch of those stories aren't going to work out. People said, oh, Bitcoin, it's going to replace dollars and currency will be obsolete. And it turns out that's just not the case. People don't use Bitcoin for currency except for a very, very small number of kinds of transactions, typically criminal ones, because for everything else, cash is actually more convenient. But sometimes the stories do work out. Actually, let me tell you one from my personal history. In 1991, I was working for a tiny, teensy-weensy little company called Intuit, who made this little checkbook program called Quicken and QuickBook. They were just developing QuickBooks. It wasn't on the market yet. And I was put in charge of a project to called the Quicken Visa card. It was actually a MasterCard at the time. Now it's a Visa card. And you would get your monthly statements. You would either download them from this thing called CompuServe, so you would download them over the phone, or we would send them to you electronically on a floppy disk. The story that we were telling ourselves was, oh, look, we're going to be able to give people a credit card where they get the record of their transactions electronically so that they don't have to type them in. Let me tell you a different story we could have told ourselves. Someday, this will be the standard. All financial statements will be downloadable. Honestly, maybe there are people who will claim we thought that at the time. We didn't think that at the time. We were just putting this little feature into Quicken that we thought would be cool, so that when we did our IPO, we would be able to say we were more than just a software company. However, if the story that we had been telling was not, we're doing this one goofy little project, if instead we had told the story, this goofy little project is going to change the way hundreds of millions of people receive their financial statements, then we might have done something like, I don't know, filed a patent. Or said, you know what, let's split off this little 5-person group into a separate company. And what we will do is create downloadable financial statement technology. And it's to this day, it is mind-blowing to think that this little project that I worked on at Intuit was literally the world's first downloadable statement. And now every statement is downloadable.
Yeah.
And I'm like, we were the first, and we told the wrong story. We told the story that it was a feature. We did not tell the story that this was going to change the world.
This is so significant, man. Steve, I absolutely love, what you shared with us today. And I absolutely love just conversing with you, period. But, here we are, we're at the end of this. And I just wanted to, give people a chance, first of all, that they've been able to grab so much from this. But, Steve, if they want to connect with you, can tell them how they can reach out to you or connect with you and what you're doing.
Sure. Well, I'm literally in this moment in the process of redefining my business. I'm working with some strategy people, and in 2 weeks, basically November 1st, 2022, we're going to pivot the business in some new direction, but I don't know what that direction is yet because we're still working on it. But if you just want to be in contact in general, and I guarantee you, whatever it is that I'm doing next, it's going to have to do with accelerating people and helping people to really create awesome and amazing careers. I just don't know if there's going to be a specialty to it or if it's going to be classes or whatever. You can find me at meetstever.com. That's MEETSTEVER, meetstever.com, and that will redirect to my website.
Excellent, guys. Thank you so much for joining us today here at The Leverage Leader. Stay tuned. And make sure that you follow Steve, connect with him and what he's doing, and so that when he does release it, you'll be one of the first to know. Thank you guys again. Have a wonderful day, and remember, something in your life can be leveraged to create something you want. God bless. Have a wonderful day.
Thanks for doing this.
My pleasure. Thank you.